The air inside the Greenwich Country Club's grand ballroom didn't just smell like money. It smelled like the curated, filtered oxygen of the elite. A cocktail of expensive tuberose, aged scotch, and the crisp ozone scent of a high-performance HVAC system. For Benjamin Hart, this was the victory lap he had spent 10 years sprint climbing toward. Standing near the mahogany bar, he adjusted the links of his French cuffs, feeling the weight of the Patek Philippe on his left wrist, a silent, ticking testament to his arrival. Beside him, Clara Thorne was the ultimate crowning achievement. She was a decade his junior, a statuesque blonde with a mind sharpened at Wharton, and tonight she was his favorite topic of conversation. "It's not just the MBA, Arthur," Benjamin said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the neighboring tables of private equity titans. He gestured toward Clara with a possessive, practiced grace. "It's the strategic rigor. She doesn't just see a market, she sees the architecture of the future. After my first marriage to, well, a sweet girl, but one who was content with the smell of flour and a sourdough starter, having an intellectual equal isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity." He laughed, a sharp, metallic sound, while Clara offered a tight, professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. Benjamin didn't notice. He was too busy burying his past under the weight of Clara's Ivy League credentials, never suspecting that the simple woman he'd left behind was currently idling in the driveway in a machine that cost more than his entire portfolio. The annual Benefactors Gala was the pulse of Connecticut's Gold Coast. It was a room where legacies were reaffirmed and newcomers were scrutinized under the harsh, sparkling light of baccarat chandeliers. Benjamin Hart felt no such scrutiny tonight. He felt like the sun. As a senior vice president at KeyBank, he had spent the last 3 years meticulously erasing the stain of his previous life, a decade spent in a cramped Brooklyn walk-up with Melissa, a woman whose highest aspiration, in his telling, was the perfect crumb on a baguette. "You have to understand the trajectory," Benjamin continued, cornering Arthur Pennington, a man whose family name was etched into the club's foundation stones. Melissa, bless her heart, was a dreamer, but her dreams were small, farmers' markets, local cooperatives. While I was pulling 80-hour weeks to close the KKR merger, she was obsessed with heirloom grains. We were speaking different languages. I needed someone who could soar, someone like Clara, who understands that life is about optimization, not kneading dough. Clara took a sip of her vintage Krug, her expression one of polite, distant satisfaction. She was the perfect partner for the man Benjamin had become, a woman of data points, spreadsheets, and cold, hard logic. She enjoyed the narrative Benjamin spun, the story of a brilliant man finally unshackled from a provincial weight. It made her feel like the prize she knew herself to be. "I'm actually handling the financial modeling for our new estate in Bellhaven myself," Clara added, her voice smooth and authoritative. Benjamin's previous contractor had a 17% margin of error. It was, frankly, embarrassing. "I've re-optimized the entire renovation schedule to bring us in under budget by Q3. "See?" Benjamin beamed, his chest swelling beneath his Tom Ford tuxedo. "Rigor. That's what's been missing. You can't build an empire on sourdough, Arthur." The Hamiltons, a couple who controlled half the commercial real estate in the tri-state area, drifted over, and Benjamin began the performance again. With every retelling, Melissa became simpler, her ambitions smaller, her existence more of a quaint mistake he had corrected. He was so deeply entrenched in the theatre of his own success that he failed to notice the subtle shift in the room's frequency. It began near the arched floor-to-ceiling windows, a low, rhythmic hum, not the aggressive, guttural bark of the Ferraris or Lamborghinis that usually lined the portico, but something deeper, a sound of immense, silent power. Then came the light, A pair of modern Matrix LED headlights swept across the ballroom, so bright and ethereal they seemed to slice through the warm amber glow of the party. Conversations didn't stop. They stuttered. Near the entrance, the younger guests, those who tracked luxury the way Benjamin tracked interest rates, began to murmur. "Is that a phantom?" someone whispered. "No," another replied. "That's a one of one. Look at the spirit of ecstasy." Benjamin, annoyed by the distraction from his monologue, turned toward the window. "Probably some crypto kid from the city who thinks a loud car replaces a lineage," he muttered to Clara, loud enough for the Hamiltons to hear. "No real class." But the car wasn't loud. It glided to a stop with the predatory silence of a shark. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase, finished in a bespoke shade of midnight blue known as lyrical nocturne, a color that seemed to absorb the very light of the stars. The valet, a young man named Leo, who had seen every luxury vehicle in existence, stood frozen on the portico, his hand hovering near the door handle, as if afraid to touch something so magnificent. The rear coach door opened, hinged at the back, swinging wide with automated, whisper-soft grace. A single shoe emerged, a Christian Louboutin heel, but not the ubiquitous red-bottomed pump Benjamin saw on every social climber in Manhattan. This was a sapphire velvet stiletto, the exact shade of the evening sky. Then a leg, slender and elegant, followed by the silhouette of a woman who seemed to command the very air around her. She wore a floor-length gown of deep navy silk by Schiaparelli, understated yet breathtakingly structural. Around her neck sat a single cascade of diamonds, the constellation piece from Van Cleef and Arpels, a museum-grade necklace that wasn't for sale, only loaned to the world's most significant icons. As she turned her head to speak to the car's other occupant, the light caught her profile. Benjamin's heart didn't just skip. It felt as though it had been gripped by a cold, unrelenting hand and squeezed. The Dom Perignon in his glass suddenly tasted like battery acid. His face, moments ago flushed with the heat of his own ego, drained to a ghastly, translucent grey. "Rick?" Clara asked, using the nickname he had long ago discarded in favor of the more formal Benjamin. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Benjamin couldn't speak. His throat was a parched canyon. He stared through the glass, his reality fracturing in real time. Because the woman stepping out of the $500,000 commission, the woman adorned in couture and starlight, was not a stranger. It was Melissa, the simple baker. The woman who was supposedly content to stay on the ground while he soared. She stood on the portico now, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority, while a man stepped out from the driver's side, a man Benjamin recognized from the cover of Forbes and the whispered legends of Thung Lung Silicon. It was Julian Vance, the founder of Apex Innovations, a man whose net worth made Benjamin's bank look like a lemonade stand. And as Julian walked around the car, his hand found the small of Melissa's back, the exact same gesture Benjamin had been making with Clara all night. But on Julian, it didn't look like possession. It looked like a partnership of equals. Benjamin felt a wave of nausea so violent he had to reach out and steady himself against the mahogany bar. The sourdough starter he had mocked was no longer a hobby. It was the foundation of an empire he hadn't even seen rising. The ballroom doors didn't just open. They seemed to dissolve. The rhythmic clink of silver against china and the practiced hum of networking died a sudden strangled death as Melissa and Julian Vance crossed the threshold. It was a social seismic event, the kind that rearranged the geography of a room in seconds. Benjamin stood paralyzed, his fingers white-knuckled around his champagne flute. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the crowd, the very titans he had been trying to impress, parted like a retreating tide. These were men and women who didn't move for anyone. Yet they stepped back instinctively, creating a gilded corridor for the woman Benjamin had once told to stop dreaming and start contribute to the rent. Melissa moved with a grace that felt ancient. There was no hurriedness in her step, no desperate scanning of the room to see who was watching. She already knew. Her Schiaparelli gown shimmered like oil on water, the deep navy silk catching the golden light of the chandeliers and turning it into something cool and lunar. Beside her, Julian Vance looked less like a tech disruptor and more like a consort. He was dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit with no tie, a move that would have been social suicide for anyone else, but on him it was a declaration of absolute sovereignty. "Mr. Caldwell," Melissa said as the club president hurried toward them, his usual stolid pace replaced by a frantic, sycophantic trot. Her voice was clear, melodic, and carried the weight of someone used to being heard. "Thank you for the invitation. Robert Sterling has told me so much about the club's work with the harbor preservation." "The honor is ours, Ms. Jensen," Caldwell stammered, nearly bowing. "We had no idea. That is, we are delighted you could join us. And Mr. Vance, a pleasure, sir. Truly." Julian offered a brief, enigmatic smile. "I'm just the +1 tonight, Howard. I go where the brilliance is." He looked at Melissa with an expression of such unvarnished admiration that Benjamin felt a phantom pain in his chest, a sharp reminder of the light he had personally extinguished in their Brooklyn apartment. Clara's hand tightened on Benjamin's arm. Her nails, manicured to lethal points, dug into his sleeve. "Benjamin," she whispered, her voice a sharp, icy blade. "You said she was a baker. You said she lived in flour and yeast." She was," Benjamin rasped, his mind frantically trying to reconcile the caricature he had built with the Queen standing 20 feet away. "This has to be some kind of elaborate performance, a gold-digging fluke." "Julian Vance doesn't do flukes," Clara snapped. Her analytical mind was already processing the data, and the results were coming back catastrophic for Benjamin's credibility. "And that necklace, it's the constellation. I did a case study on Van Cleef's marketing strategy at Wharton. They don't loan that to flukes. They loan it to brand icons." As if sensing the heat of their gaze, Melissa's eyes swept the room. When they landed on Benjamin, he felt a primal urge to bolt. But he was anchored by his own ego, trapped in the spotlight of his own making. Melissa didn't flinch. She didn't look triumphant or angry. She gave him a brief, polite nod, the kind one gives to a distant, vaguely unpleasant acquaintance, and then turned back to the club president. That nod was worse than a slap. It was an erasure. "I need a real drink," Benjamin muttered, lunging toward the bar. He ordered a Macallan 25, neat, and downed it in 2 burning gulps. He needed the scotch to cauterize the wound to his pride, but it only seemed to sharpen the reality. He watched from the periphery as the high society hierarchy reconfigured itself. The Hamiltons, who had just been listening to Benjamin's stories about his Bellhaven renovations, were now hovering near Melissa, desperate for an introduction. Arthur Pennington, the law firm partner Benjamin so desperately craved respect from, was already deep in conversation with Julian Vance, his posture submissive. "We have to go over there," Clara said, her voice regaining its professional composure, though her eyes remained hard. "What? No," Benjamin hissed. "Why?" "Because standing here like a sulking child makes you look guilty, and by extension makes me look like I've backed a losing horse," Clara said. The cruelty in her tone was clinical. "You told everyone she was a simple woman. If we don't greet her, it looks like you're afraid of the truth. We control the narrative, Benjamin. We go over, we act gracious, and we find out how a thimble-brained baker ended up on the arm of a trillion-dollar visionary. She didn't wait for his consent. She began to move, pulling him along like a reluctant accessory. As they approached the inner circle, the conversation died down. Melissa was holding a glass of mineral water, looking perfectly at home amidst the wolves. "Melissa," Benjamin said, his voice sounding thin and reedy in his own ears. He tried to inject a note of paternal warmth into it, a desperate attempt to reclaim the old power dynamic. "It's been quite some time. You look well." Melissa turned. Close up, the change in her was even more devastating. The fine lines of stress that had once etched her forehead during their marriage were gone, replaced by a radiant, settled confidence. "Benjamin," she said, her voice even, "it has been a long time, and you look exactly as I expected." The barb was so subtle, so elegantly delivered, that it took a moment for the sting to register. She wasn't complimenting his success, she was noting his predictability. "This is my fiancée, Clara Thorne," Benjamin said, puffing out his chest, leaning on the Wharton shield one last time. "Wharton MBA. She's actually handling the financial modeling for our new property." Melissa's gaze shifted to Clara. She extended a hand, the Van Cleef diamonds shimmering at her throat. "A pleasure, Clara. Benjamin told me so little about you during our time together, but then again, he was always so focused on his own trajectory. I'm glad he's found someone to help him with his margins." Clara took the hand, her grip firm, her eyes searching Melissa's face for a weakness she couldn't find. "The pleasure is mine. Rick, Benjamin, has told me a great deal about you. Your passion for bread, was it?" Melissa smiled, a genuine warm expression that made Benjamin's heart ache with a sudden, unbidden memory of a kitchen filled with the scent of rising dough. "Bread is just chemistry and patience, Clara," Melissa said softly. "Much like business. If you rush the fermentation, the whole thing collapses under its own weight. Wouldn't you agree, Julian?" Julian Vance stepped forward, his presence instantly dimming the lights of everyone else in the circle. He placed a hand on Melissa's shoulder, a gesture of quiet, absolute partnership. "I agree entirely, honey. In fact, that's why I invested. Most people see the loaf. I saw the logistics." He then turned his gaze to Benjamin. It wasn't a look of judgment. It was the look a biologist might give to a particularly common specimen of pond life. "Davenport, isn't it? Key Bank?" "Yes, sir," Benjamin said, his professional mask slipping into place, though his hands were trembling. "I get a lot of proposals from your firm," Julian said, taking a slow sip of his water. "Most of them are quite standard, lacking in vision, but I suppose that's the nature of traditional banking. It's built to assess what already exists, rather than what's being built from scratch." He turned back to Melissa, effectively erasing Benjamin from the conversation. "Shall we find our table, darling? Robert is waving us over." As they walked away, Benjamin stood in the wake of their passage, feeling like a ghost. He looked down at his Macallan glass. At the bottom sat a single melting ice cube. Beside him, Clara was silent. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching Melissa Jensen greet Robert Sterling with a hug, the kind of hug reserved for family, for equals, for the truly powerful. "Benjamin," Clara said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Yes?" "You have 5 minutes to tell me exactly how a simple baker became the CEO of something Julian Vance calls the future, or I am leaving this club and this ring behind." Benjamin opened his mouth to lie, to spin, to protect the fortress of glass he had built. But then his eyes landed on a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers. On the tray sat a small, perfectly formed, artisanal sourdough roll. It was rustic, dusted with flour, the crust crackling with an internal strength. It was a symbol of everything he had mocked. And tonight it was the only thing in the room that felt real. The conservatory of the Greenwich Country Club was designed for discreet concessions and private humiliations. It was a glass-walled sanctuary filled with rare orchids and the heavy, humid scent of status. Benjamin allowed Clara to lead him there, his legs feeling like they were made of damp cardboard. He could still hear the muffled roar of the ballroom, the laughter, the clinking crystal, but in the stillness of the greenery, the silence was an interrogation. Clara turned on him, her back to a sprawling Cattleya orchid. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of her face, making her look like a marble bust of a vengeful goddess. "Start talking, Benjamin," she said. Her voice wasn't raised, which was worse. It was the voice she used for hostile takeovers. "I've spent the last hour watching the most powerful man in the room treat your simple ex-wife like she's the Oracle of Delphi. I've watched Julian Vance, a man who doesn't even take calls from the Secretary of State, act as her bodyguard. You told me she was a provincial hobbyist. You told me you left because she lacked ambition. So, either you're a liar or you're the most incompetent judge of human capital I've ever met." I didn't know, Clara," Benjamin stammered, his hands shoved deep into his tuxedo pockets to hide the tremors. "I swear, when we were together, it was all flour. It was mess. It was sourdough starters sitting on the counter like science projects. She didn't want to talk about mergers or P&E ratios. She wanted to talk about the hydration levels of dough. I thought she was small town. I thought I was the one with the vision." "Vision?" Clara let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a dry branch snapping. "Benjamin, look at that table. Look at her. She isn't just a guest, she's the atmosphere." Before Benjamin could formulate a defense, the glass door to the conservatory creaked open. Arthur Pennington stepped inside, a glass of vintage port in his hand. He looked energized, his face flushed with the kind of excitement usually reserved for a record-breaking IPO. "There you are, Hart," Arthur boomed, oblivious to the frost in the air. "Quite a night, eh? I was just speaking with Robert Sterling. He's absolutely smitten with your ex-wife's latest venture. I have to admit, I'm a bit embarrassed. You've been holding out on us." Benjamin felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. "Arthur, it's been a long time. I haven't kept up with Melissa's projects." "Projects?" Arthur raised a silver eyebrow. "My boy, if you call a 9-figure acquisition a project, I'd love to see what you call a career. My wife, Eleanor, has been obsessed with Aurelia's Kitchen for 2 years. She's on the waiting list for their subscription boxes. $100 a loaf, can you imagine? And people pay it gladly." Benjamin's breath hitched. Aurelia. It was Melissa's middle name, a name she had always hated because it sounded too old-fashioned. He remembered her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands dusted with white powder, sketching a logo on a napkin, a simple, elegant A entwined with a wheat stalk. He had laughed and told her it looked like a funeral parlour's stationery. "It started with that one sourdough," Arthur continued, swirling his port. "The one the Times called the bread that broke the internet. Apparently, Julian Vance's venture firm didn't just invest for the product, they invested for the tech. Melissa Jensen developed a proprietary AI-driven fermentation monitoring system that ensures every loaf, regardless of where it's baked, is identical to the one she made in her Brooklyn kitchen. She turned craft into a scalable luxury asset. It's the Hermes of food, Hart." The world seemed to tilt. Benjamin saw a memory. Melissa, tears in her eyes, trying to show him a spreadsheet she'd made on an old laptop. "Ricky, if I can just map out the supply chain for this specific rye from the Piedmont Valley, I can guarantee the flavor profile," she had said. And he had replied, without looking up from his phone, "Honey, no one cares about rye from Italy. They care about price points. Just buy the bulk flour from the distributor and stop playing CEO." "The rumors are," Arthur added, leaning in closer, "that the global food conglomerate Nestlé Aero is closing a deal to acquire the brand for $900 million, and Melissa stays on as CEO with full autonomy. She's not just rich, Benjamin. She's a titan." Arthur patted Benjamin on the shoulder, a gesture that felt like a death knell, and wandered back toward the bar. Clara was staring at Benjamin, her expression shifting from anger to a chilling clinical pity. $900 million, she whispered, "and you told me her biggest dream was a card table at a farmer's market." "I didn't think it was real," Benjamin said, his voice a pathetic rasp. "I thought it was just bread." "It's never just bread, you fool," Clara hissed. "It's the execution. It's the very rigor I thought I was bringing to your life. She had it all along, and you were too arrogant to see it because it didn't come with a Wharton degree." At that moment, Howard Caldwell, the club manager, hurried past the conservatory doors, followed by two young men in navy blue uniforms. They were carrying insulated containers embossed with that same elegant A logo Benjamin had once mocked. Through the glass, Benjamin watched as the manager received the containers with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the Shroud of Turin. Within minutes, the club's standard bread baskets were being whisked away, replaced by the warm, aromatic loaves of Aurelia's kitchen. Benjamin felt the floor drop out from under him. The very establishment he had spent a decade trying to join was now bowing to the woman he had discarded as not good enough for his circle. He looked back at the ballroom. Through the open doors, he saw Melissa. She was laughing at something Julian Vance had said, her face luminous. She picked up a piece of the bread, her bread, and tore it open. The steam rose in a delicate plume, and for a second the scent of yeast and warmth drifted into the conservatory, bypassing the expensive HVAC system, bypassing the perfumes and the scotch. It was the smell of the life he had thrown away. It was the smell of a woman who had built a world from scratch while he was busy trying to find a seat at someone else's table. Clara stepped away from him, her heels clicking sharply on the stone floor. "I'm going back to the ballroom," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I have a job offer to discuss with Nathaniel Croft." "And Benjamin?" He looked at her, his eyes hollow. "Don't follow me. You're beginning to smell like failure." Benjamin stood alone among the orchids, a half-empty glass of expensive scotch in his hand, watching his ex-wife command the room. He realized then that Melissa Jensen hadn't just pulled up in a billionaire's car. She had built the road, the car, and the destination. And he was just a footnote in her spectacular rising story. Benjamin stepped back into the ballroom, but the atmosphere had curdled. The golden light of the chandeliers now felt clinical, like the lamps in an operating theatre. He felt exposed, his Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly feeling like a cheap costume. Every time a guest laughed, he was certain the joke was at his expense. Every time a head turned, he expected to see a sneer. The fortress of glass wasn't just cracking, it was shattering into a million jagged shards that reflected his own panicked face. The centerpiece of the room was no longer the mahogany bar or the silent auction items. It was the benefactor's table where Melissa sat. She was flanked by Julian Vance and Robert Sterling, a triumvirate of power that made the rest of the room look like background actors. But the real executioner wasn't Melissa herself. It was the bread. The scent of Aurelia's kitchen sourdough had permeated the hall. It was a warm, yeasty, grounding aroma that stood in stark defiance of the cold, metallic prestige Benjamin had cultivated. He watched as the most influential people in the state, governors, CEOs, legacy families, tore into the rolls with a primitive, unironic joy. "Davenport!" a voice barked. Benjamin jumped. It was Mark Peterson, his managing director at KeyBank. Mark was a man who measured human value in basis points and loyalty in closed deals. He was currently holding a half-eaten roll in one hand and a glass of vintage Bordeaux in the other. "Mark," Benjamin said, trying to summon the ghost of his professional bravado. "Fine evening, isn't it?" "Is it?" Mark asked, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the roll, then at Benjamin, then toward the main table. "I've been hearing some fascinating color from Arthur Pennington. He tells me that woman over there, the one Julian Vance is practically worshipping, is your ex-wife, the one you described as sweet but simple during our last performance review, the one you said lacked the intellectual stamina for high-stakes environments." Benjamin's collar felt like a noose. "Mark, people change. She must have found a good team. She was always a hobbyist when we were—" "A hobbyist?" Mark cut him off, his voice dropping to a dangerous low-register growl. Julian Vance just told Sterling that she's the most gifted logistics architect he's seen in 20 years. He said her proprietary fermentation algorithms are going to disrupt the entire organic supply chain. That's not a hobby, Benjamin. That's an asset. And if you sat across the dinner table from that kind of asset for a decade and didn't see it, then I have to wonder about your ability to spot value anywhere else. Mark didn't wait for a response. He simply turned his back, a gesture of social and professional excommunication that left Benjamin breathless. Driven by a desperate, self-destructive impulse, the primal urge of a drowning man to grab onto the very thing that sank him, Benjamin began to walk toward the main table. He felt Clara's eyes on him from across the room. She was leaning in toward Nathaniel Croft, her posture feline and predatory, already negotiating her exit from Benjamin's life. He ignored her. He needed to talk to Melissa. He needed to find a way to recontextualize the past before it finished burying him. As he approached, the conversation at the table didn't stop, but it changed. The warmth didn't vanish. It simply redirected, leaving Benjamin in the cold shadow of their collective disregard. "Melissa," Benjamin said, reaching the edge of the table. He didn't wait for an opening. "I was just thinking about that first starter you grew, in the blue ceramic bowl. Remember? In that tiny kitchen on 4th Street. It was a pathetic play, a reach for a shared intimacy that no longer existed. He hoped the mention of their humble beginnings would humanize him, would remind her of the man he was before the Tom Ford suits and the bank vice presidency. Melissa looked up. She didn't look annoyed. She looked at him with the same calm, analytical curiosity Julian Vance had used earlier. She set her silver butter knife down with a soft clink that sounded like a gavel. "I remember that bowl, Benjamin," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but the table went silent, and the silence rippled outward until the nearby guests were leaning in to witness the carnage. "I remember it because you threw it in the trash when we moved to the new apartment. You said it didn't fit the aesthetic of a rising executive's home. You said the smell of the yeast made your suit smell like a peasant's cottage." A collective, muffled intake of breath went around the table. Robert Sterling's face hardened. Julian Vance's expression remained placid, but his eyes were like flint. "I was stressed, Mel," Benjamin stammered, the name feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "I was trying to build a future for us. I made mistakes, sure, but we were a team. I supported you for 10 years while you experimented. I gave you the stability to find your way." Melissa stood up then. She didn't do it quickly or aggressively. She rose with the quiet, terrifying dignity of someone who had already won the war. The Van Cleef diamonds at her throat caught the light, casting a halo of fractured brilliance across her face. "You didn't give me stability, Benjamin. You gave me an ultimatum," she said. Her voice was steady, carrying to the back of the room now. "You told me that if I didn't grow up and stop playing with flour, you would find someone who understood the language of success. And you did. You found Clara." She gestured toward the bar, where Clara was now laughing at something Nathaniel Croft had said, her Wharton ring glinting as she tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. "The irony is," Melissa continued, her eyes locking onto Benjamin's with a searing intensity, "the language of success isn't about the degree or the title. It's about the work. While you were busy climbing, I was busy building. While you were optimizing your image, I was optimizing a world. I didn't succeed because of your support, Benjamin. I succeeded because I finally stopped believing your definition of what a simple woman could be." She leaned in just a fraction, her voice dropping so only those at the table could hear the final blow. "And for the record, Julian didn't invest because he's a billionaire who likes bread. He invested because I showed him a way to feed people better, faster and more honestly. Something you wouldn't understand, because there's no margin for honesty in your financial models." She turned to Julian and smiled. "I think I'd like to go home now, Julian. The air in here is getting a bit stale. "Of course, darling," Julian said, rising and draped her wrap over her shoulders with a tenderness that felt like a physical strike to Benjamin's ribs. The room watched in absolute cathedral silence as the two of them walked toward the exit. No one looked at Benjamin. He stood at the edge of the most important table in the state, a man who had spent his life trying to be the main character, only to realize he was merely the villain in someone else's origin story. He looked down at the table. There was a single roll left in the basket. He reached out, his hand shaking, and took a bite. It was perfect. The crust was a dark, caramelized amber, snapping with a sharp, salt-kissed resistance. The interior was airy, complex, and tasted of ancient grains and a decade of patient, ignored genius. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, and it felt like ash in his mouth. He looked up and saw Clara walking toward the exit as well, not toward him, but toward the valet stand. She didn't even look back. She had already re-optimized her portfolio. Benjamin Hart was alone. And for the first time in his life, the silence wasn't an interrogation, it was a mirror. The silence in Benjamin's apartment was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating like the humid air before a thunderstorm. After Clara had walked away at the club, leaving the cushion-cut diamond ring glittering on the mahogany bar like a tiny, malevolent star, Benjamin had driven home in a state of suspended animation. Now, standing in his stark, monochromatic living room, a space he had once considered the epitome of modern sophistication, the silence began to scream. The polished concrete floors, the charcoal flannel sofa, the single abstract painting that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, it all felt like a mausoleum he had built for a life that had just died. He spent the night oscillating between frantic denial and waves of pure, undiluted despair. He replayed the evening in his head, each memory a fresh laceration, the whispers, the pity in Arthur Pennington's eyes, Clara's clinical fury, and above all, the image of Melissa, serene and untouchable. At 3 a.m., he reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Clara's name. He had to fix this. He would explain, apologize, grovel. He would tell her she was right, that he had been an arrogant fool, but that they were still a power couple. He called. It rang, each chime amplifying the cavernous emptiness of the room before clicking over to her crisp, professional voicemail. "You've reached Clara Thorne. Please leave a message." He left a rambling, desperate one, then another. He sent a flurry of texts, a digital torrent of pleas. By dawn, he tried calling again. This time, it didn't ring. A single sterile beep informed him that his call could not be completed. Blocked. The finality of it was like a door slamming shut in a vacuum. At 10 a.m. the doorman buzzed. "Mr. Hart, Mr. John Chandler is here with a delivery for you." A cold dread washed over Benjamin. He hadn't expected Clara's father himself. John Chandler was a man whose family had owned shipping lines since the 1800s. A man who treated social standing as a biological fact. When Benjamin reached the lobby, John stood there, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression carved from granite. Beside him stood a single, elegant Toomey suitcase, the one Benjamin kept at Clara's penthouse. "John," Benjamin began, his voice cracking, "please, I can explain. Clara and I just had a misunderstanding." John Chandler looked at him with the chilling detachment of a man observing a clerical error. He didn't offer his hand. "My daughter," John said slowly, his voice resonating with the authority of old money, "is an exceptional judge of character and a shrewd assessor of value. She has simply corrected a portfolio error. She realized she was over-leveraged in an asset with no underlying substance." "John, I love her," Benjamin pleaded. "You love her pedigree, Benjamin. You love the way her MBA looks on your arm," John countered. "But you lack the one thing my family respects, the ability to see the horizon. You were married to a visionary for a decade, and you called her a baker. That isn't just a personal failing, it's an intellectual one. Goodbye." John turned and walked away, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swinging shut with a definitive thud. The doorman studiously avoided Benjamin's gaze, busying himself with a stack of mail. The humiliation was absolute, delivered with the cold precision of a corporate takeover. Going to work an hour later was an act of profound self-punishment. The atmosphere at KeyBank had shifted seismically. The usual morning chatter by the Bloomberg terminals died down as he approached. His colleagues, men he had shared expensive scotch and insider jokes with, now offered tight, fleeting smiles and averted their eyes. News of the Greenwich implosion had travelled faster than a market crash. The summons came just before lunch. Mark Peterson's executive assistant didn't smile as she ushered Benjamin into the corner office. The view of the Long Island Sound was spectacular today, the water a shimmering, mocking blue. "Close the door, Benjamin," Mark said, not looking up from a file. "Mark, about last night." "I'm not interested in the drama, Ben," Mark interrupted, finally looking up. His eyes were like two cold flints. "I'm interested in the optics of my senior VP being a laughingstock. But more importantly, I'm interested in the fundamental lack of foresight you've demonstrated." "It was a private matter," Benjamin argued. "There is no such thing as a private matter in this business," Mark snapped, leaning forward. "We sell one thing at this bank: trust. We tell our clients we have the vision to see around corners, to spot the unicorns before the rest of the world does. And yet, I have a man on my leadership team who lived with a 9-figure founder for 10 years and thought she was a simple woman who liked flour. Do you know how that looks to our LPs? It looks like you're blind." Mark tossed a printout onto the desk. It was a Wall Street Journal alert. Global food conglomerate Nestlé Aero acquires Aurelia's Kitchen in deal valued at $900 million. Founder Melissa Jensen to join board. $900 million, Mark whispered. Julian Vance saw it. Arthur Pennington's wife saw it. Even the guy who parks the cars at the club saw it. But you were too busy bragging about Clara's Wharton degree to notice you were sleeping in the same bed as the most successful artisanal startup of the decade. Mark, It's a credibility issue, Ben. If you couldn't assess the value of your own wife, how in God's name can I trust you to assess the value of a tech merger? Your judgment is compromised by your own ego. It's a liability we can't afford. Mark reached into his desk and pulled out a manila envelope. "We're prepared to offer a generous severance package, a clean break to pursue other opportunities, but you're done here." Benjamin walked out of the glass towers of KeyBank carrying a cardboard box of his personal effects. The Patek Philippe on his wrist felt heavy, a ticking monument to a status that no longer existed. He went back to his empty apartment and finally did what he had been dreading. He opened his laptop and typed Aurelia's Kitchen into the search bar. The website was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury. He clicked the Founder's Story tab. A photo of Melissa appeared, not in a gown, but in a simple linen shirt, standing in a field of wheat, laughing. It started with a simple question. The text read, "Can a loaf of bread be a work of art?" In a small, cramped apartment kitchen in Brooklyn, our founder Melissa decided the answer was yes. Benjamin stared at the words, small, cramped apartment kitchen. His kitchen. He realized then that he hadn't just divorced a woman, he had divorced her vision. He had belittled her passion because it didn't fit into a spreadsheet. He had been so obsessed with the appearance of success that he had failed to recognize the substance of it standing right next to him. He looked at the severance agreement on the counter. It was a generous amount, but compared to the $900 million deal Melissa had just closed, it was nothing but crumbs. He had fought so hard to win a game of his own invention, only to realize Melissa had simply built a better world. Benjamin Hart didn't just lose his job and his fiancée. He lost the ability to exist in a world that wasn't haunted by Melissa Jensen. Within 48 hours of the gala, the Greenwich implosion had transcended the local gossip circles and bled into the digital ether. It began with a blind item on a high society blog, but by Tuesday morning it had morphed into a full-scale viral phenomenon. He sat in his darkened living room, the blue light of his laptop illuminating the hollows of his cheeks. He shouldn't have clicked the link, but his thumb had a mind of its own. It was a video from a prominent business influencer titled, "The $900 million Mistake. Why Benjamin Hart is the worst value investor in history." The thumbnail was a split screen. On one side, a grainy photo of Benjamin looking panicked at the gala bar. On the other, Melissa radiant in her Schiaparelli gown next to the number $900 million in bright neon font. "The lesson here, guys, is simple," the influencer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Don't confuse a lack of pedigree with a lack of potential. This guy, Hart, had a front-row seat to the birth of a luxury empire, and he spent 10 years trying to get her to optimize into a secretary. He fumbled the ultimate bag." Benjamin slammed the laptop shut. The phrase, "fumbled the bag," echoed in his mind like a taunt. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. Every time he stepped into the hallway of his building, he felt the doorman's pity. Every time he checked his LinkedIn, he saw, "Congratulate Melissa Jensen on her new position as board member at Nestlé Aero." Driven by a morbid, masochistic curiosity, he began to dig through the digital archives of Melissa's rise, things he had actively ignored when they were married. He found a long-form interview she'd done with Wired 6 months prior under the pseudonym Aurelia. "The hardest part wasn't the logistics," Melissa had told the interviewer. "It was the noise. I was living with someone who believed that if a dream couldn't be measured in a quarterly earnings report, it wasn't a dream, it was a distraction. I had to learn to build in the dark. I had to treat my ambition like a secret, because if I shared it, it would be dissected and dismissed as cute. Every loaf of bread I baked in those early days was a silent act of rebellion." Benjamin closed his eyes, and a memory, sharp and jagged as a broken glass, surfaced. It was 8 years ago. Their kitchen in Brooklyn had been sweltering, the air thick with the smell of fermentation. Melissa had been sitting at the small, wobbly wooden table surrounded by hand-drawn maps of the Piedmont region in Italy. "Ricky, look," she had said, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity he had mistaken for obsession. "I found them. A family in the Varieta Valley. They grow this heirloom rye that has a natural nuttiness you can't find anywhere else. If I can secure an exclusive supply chain, the flavor profile will be impossible to replicate. It's the moat, Ricky, like in those business books you read." He had barely looked up from his briefcase, his mind already at the office. "A moat for bread, Mel. Really. It's flour. People want it cheap and fast. You're spending hundreds of dollars on international shipping for a profile that 99% of people won't taste. It's not a business plan, it's an expensive hobby. Why don't you focus on getting that part-time job at the gallery? That's real work." He remembered the way her shoulders had slumped, not in defeat, he realized now, but in the quiet, grim acceptance that she was alone in her tower. She hadn't stopped. She had just stopped telling him. Now he stood up and walked to his kitchen. It was a high-end, designer space with Miele appliances that had never seen a speck of flour. He began opening cabinets, searching for something he couldn't name. In the very back of the pantry, behind a bottle of expensive truffle oil he'd bought to impress Clara, he found it. A dusty glass mason jar. He pulled it out. It was an old sourdough starter, the Aurelia starter. Melissa must have left it behind in the move, tucked away and forgotten. He unscrewed the lid. The contents were grey, dried, and smelled of neglect. It was a dead thing, a relic of a decade of growth he had tried to prune into insignificance. He stared at the jar, and for the first time, the soap opera of his life, the gala, the job, the public firing, faded away, leaving only a vast, hollow ache. He had lived with a genius for 10 years and treated her like a burden. He had been so proud of his intellectual equal Clara, but Clara was just a mirror reflecting his own ego. Melissa had been a window into a world he was too small to see. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from an unknown number. He opened it, expecting more harassment or a late-night mocking from an ex-colleague. Instead, it was a photograph. The resolution was perfect, the colors vibrant. It was taken on a pristine white sand beach, the water a brilliant, impossible turquoise. In the center of the frame stood Melissa. She was barefoot in a simple white sundress, her hair blowing in the sea breeze. She was laughing, a full-throated, uninhibited laugh of pure joy. Julian Vance stood beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at Melissa. And on her left hand, catching the Caribbean sun, was not a massive, showy diamond, but a simple, impossibly elegant sapphire ring that perfectly matched the color of the ocean. There was no text, no caption. It was a silent, devastating message from the universe. Benjamin sat on the floor of his million-dollar kitchen, clutching a jar of dead yeast, watching the woman he had belittled become the queen of a world he couldn't even afford to visit. The hard karma wasn't just the loss of his status. It was the realization that he was the only person in his life who had ever been simple. He looked at the sapphire on her finger in the photo. It was a symbol of a partnership built on vision, not optimization. He realized then that Julian Vance hadn't just invested in her company, he had invested in her soul, the very thing Benjamin had tried to trade for a seat at the Greenwich Country Club. The silence of the apartment was no longer menacing. It was just empty. The finality of a life's collapse doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it arrives with the soft, systematic rustle of packing paper. Benjamin sat on the floor of his living room surrounded by cardboard boxes that bore the logos of high-end moving companies. His Patek Philippe sat on the edge of a crate, its steady ticking the only heartbeat in the room. He had already sold the M5. The lease on the Belhaven property had been terminated with a penalty that gutted his remaining savings. He was moving into a one-bedroom rental in a part of the city where the doorman didn't know his name, and the trajectory of his life was no longer a topic of conversation. A week after the $900 million acquisition of Aurelia's kitchen became official, a courier arrived. He expected more legal fallout from the bank, or perhaps a final biting letter from Clara's attorneys. Instead, the envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore no return address. Inside was a single document, a waiver of the remaining alimony Benjamin had been begrudgingly paying Melissa for the last 5 years. It was a drop in the ocean of her new net worth, a rounding error in her empire, but the note attached was what broke the last of his defenses. It wasn't written on corporate stationery. It was a simple piece of lined paper, the kind Melissa used to use for her grocery lists. "I don't want your money, Rick. I never did. I wanted you to believe in the bread. I've directed the remaining balance of the settlement to a scholarship fund for aspiring entrepreneurs without Ivy League degrees. I think you'd agree it's a better use of the capital. Be well, M." Benjamin held the paper until his knuckles turned white. He had spent years resenting those checks, viewing them as a tax on his success, a penalty for having been tethered to a woman who refused to grow. Now she had dismissed his financial contribution with a flick of a pen, not out of malice, but out of total, devastating indifference. He wasn't a villain to her. He was a debt she had finally settled. Driven by a strange, masochistic hunger for the truth, Benjamin did something he hadn't done in a decade. He walked. He left his sterile apartment and took the subway, not the town car, to the Upper West Side, where the first Aurelia's Kitchen flagship store had just opened. The line stretched around the block. It wasn't just foodies or influencers. There were construction workers, teachers, and elderly couples standing alongside the very socialites who had once ignored Melissa at the club. They were all there for the same thing: Benjamin stood at the back of the line. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to cut to the front. He wasn't looking for a VIP entrance. He was just a man waiting for bread. As he neared the entrance, the sensory assault hit him. It wasn't the sterile, filtered air of Keybank or the floral perfume of the Greenwich Country Club. It was the scent of the Varaita Valley rye, nutty, deep, and ancient. It was the sound of the steam injection ovens and the rhythmic, percussive thud of dough being shaped by hand. The interior was a masterclass in authentic luxury. There were no Wharton degrees on the walls, no marble statues. Instead, there were photos of the farmers in Italy, the millers in Vermont, and the chemistry of the fermentation process explained in elegant, hand-lettered chalk. When he reached the counter, the young woman behind it smiled at him. She looked like Melissa had 10 years ago, bright-eyed, flower on her apron, genuinely happy to be there. "Welcome to Aurelia's," she said. "What can I get for you today?" Benjamin looked at the menu, his eyes blurred. The sourdough," he managed to say. "The original Aurelia." "Great choice. It just came out of the oven, still warm." He paid with a $20 bill, the same bill he used to think was too much for a loaf of bread. When she handed him the brown paper bag, the heat of the loaf seeped through the paper and into his palms. It felt like a living thing. He walked to a nearby park bench and sat down. He didn't wait to get home. He tore the bag open. The loaf was a dark, scorched amber, the crust crackling as the air hit it. He broke it in half, and a cloud of fragrant, yeasty steam rose into the cold afternoon air. He took a bite. It was a symphony of everything he had dismissed. The crunch of the crust was a testament to the proprietary algorithms Julian Vance had praised. The soft, elastic crumb was the result of the wasteful Italian rye Melissa had fought for. But beneath the technical excellence, there was something else, a taste of the Brooklyn kitchen, of the midnight hours Melissa had spent while he slept, of the quiet resilience of a woman who had been told her dreams were cute and decided to make them colossal instead. He chewed slowly, the salt and the tang of the sourdough hitting the back of his throat. He realized then that Clara's MBA, his Tom Ford suits, and the $500,000 Rolls-Royce were all just different ways of trying to buy what was in this bread, truth. Melissa hadn't built a company to get revenge on him. She hadn't pulled up at the gala to rub his nose in her success. She had simply become who she was always meant to be once she stopped trying to fit into his spreadsheets. He looked at the half loaf of bread in his hands. It was the most valuable thing he owned. He had lost the job, the girl, and the status, but as he sat on that bench, surrounded by the mundane noise of the city, he felt a strange, terrifying lightness. The fortress of glass was gone. There was nothing left to brag about, nothing left to optimize. He took another bite, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't think about his trajectory. He just tasted the bread. The light in the kitchen of the community center in Astoria was not the dramatic, staged gold of a country club ballroom. It was the honest, unvarnished light of a Tuesday morning, filtered through windows that needed a good scrubbing. Benjamin Hart, known here simply as Ben, didn't mind. He liked the way the dust motes danced in the sun, settling on his flour-dusted forearms. He was no longer wearing a Patek Philippe. A simple utilitarian Timex was strapped to his wrist, keeping time for the ovens. He wore a heavy denim apron over a faded t-shirt. His hands, once manicured and soft from a life of sliding touchscreens and gripping scotch glasses, were now calloused and stained with the honest work of a baker. After the Greenwich implosion, Benjamin had spent months in a fugue state of self-pity. But the taste of that sourdough on the park bench had acted like a compass. He had realized he couldn't go back to the glass towers, not because they wouldn't have him, though they wouldn't, but because he could no longer breathe that filtered air. He had spent his life trying to be a high-value asset, only to realize he had been a hollow one. He now worked as the head of the Rise Up program, a non-profit initiative that taught vocational baking and small business logistics to formerly incarcerated individuals and at-risk youth. It was a job that paid a fraction of his old bonus, but for the first time in 40 years, Benjamin Hart felt like he was standing on solid ground. "Ben, the hydration on this batch feels off," a young man named Marcus said, leaning over a stainless steel bowl. Marcus was 19, with a sharp mind and a past that had nearly swallowed him whole. Benjamin walked over, not with the condescending gait of a VP, but with the quiet pace of a partner. He plunged his hands into the dough. He didn't look at a spreadsheet. He felt the resistance, the stickiness, the life within the yeast. "It's the humidity, Marcus," Benjamin said softly. "The air is heavy today. The flour is drinking more than usual. We don't force it. We listen to it. Give it another 10 minutes of rest, then fold it gently. Patience is the only ingredient you can't buy in bulk." Marcus nodded, a look of genuine focus on his face. Benjamin watched him and felt a quiet, profound swell of pride, not the ego-driven pride of a merger closed, but the soul-deep satisfaction of a seed planted. In the corner of the kitchen, sitting on a shelf next to the industrial mixers, was a blue ceramic bowl. It wasn't the original one he had thrown away in Brooklyn, that was gone forever, but it was a twin he had found in a thrift store. Inside it lived his own starter. It wasn't an Aurelia clone. It was his own, built from the wild yeast of his new neighborhood and the patience of his new life. He picked up a copy of the New York Times that someone had left on the break table. On the cover of the business section was a photo of Melissa. She was standing at a podium at the United Nations, speaking about sustainable food systems. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely herself. The article mentioned her recent marriage to Julian Vance and the birth of their first child. Benjamin looked at the photo for a long time. The vast, hollow ache he had felt months ago was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet respect. He didn't feel the urge to call her or to explain himself. The debt was paid. Her success wasn't his revenge, it was her truth. And his failure wasn't his end, it was his beginning. He thought back to the sapphire ring in the Caribbean photo. It no longer felt like a symbol of his loss. It felt like a reminder that value isn't something you brag about. It's something you protect. As the morning shift ended, Benjamin began to prep a small table near the window. He sliced a loaf of the bread they had baked that morning, a simple, rustic whole wheat. He put out a small dish of olive oil and a few pieces of fruit. A woman named Sarah, who ran the literacy program next door, walked in. They had been sharing lunch for 3 weeks. No talk of trajectories, no mentions of Ivy League degrees. Just talk of the neighborhood, the students, and the books they were reading. "Smells like heaven in here today, Ben," she said, sitting down. "It's just the rye," he replied, handing her a warm slice. "It takes its time, but it's worth the wait." As they sat in the quiet kitchen, the sunlight warming the table, Benjamin took a bite of the bread. It was salty, earthy, and imperfect. It was exactly what he needed. He looked out the window at the bustling Astoria street, at the people living their simple lives with extraordinary courage. He wasn't a titan, he wasn't a vice president, he was just a man who knew how to bake bread and how to listen. And as the steam from the loaf rose between him and Sarah, Benjamin Hart finally felt like he had arrived at the only destination that ever mattered, the truth of who he was when no one was watching. The fortress of glass was gone. In its place was a house built of stone, flour, and the slow, beautiful rise of a life reclaimed. The story of Benjamin and Melissa is a cinematic journey through the highs of ego and the redemptive lows of hard-earned humility. It serves as a powerful reminder that true success isn't found in a title, a degree, or the car we drive, but in the authenticity of our connections and the courage to honor the simple dreams of those we love. If you found Rick's downfall and Ben's eventual healing as moving as we did, please consider supporting our work. Like this video to help the algorithm share this message of resilience. Share it with someone who might be forgetting their own value. And subscribe to join our community of storytellers. Let's keep building worlds worth living in, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.